Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss the end of the government shutdown, Trump's threat to sue the BBC into oblivion, and a new book from our own Stephen Adubato. I'm joined by Ashley Frawley and Geoff Shullenberger, with special guest Stephen Adubato later in the podcast, and I am Matthew Schmitz. So the government shutdown has come to an end. Some Democrats went over and joined the Republicans in voting to bring it back. And there's a lot at play here. There have been, food stamps, but really, I think the most important issue is healthcare subsidies, which many Americans rely on. If they expire, if they're allowed to expire as they're set to do and they aren't extended, the health insurance costs for many Americans will go up by hundreds a month. And these subsidies were brought in, during the kind of pandemic. Republicans, many of them want to get rid of them because they're immensely costly. But the kind of basic story here, I think, is that the GOP has just failed to provide an alternative to Obamacare, which it has long opposed and railed against, but it really hasn't offered an alternative that would effectively bring down costs, the really basic issue. So it seems that nobody loves our healthcare system, but no one is seriously proposing a more workable alternative to it. Geoff, how are you feeling about the return of the federal government now that it's no longer shut down? And what's your read of this healthcare fight?
Well, I mean, there was something strange about just sort of thinking about what it actually means for the government to be shut down. I sort of remember going back to the 90s, vaguely being conscious of the shutdown enacted by House Republicans led by Newt Gingrich at the time. I can't remember the exact nature of the controversy, but it was considered this kind of alarming and shocking thing at the time, but now it seems to have become sort of habitual. And I suppose it's ironic in part because Congress itself has become so ineffectual and increasingly happy to surrender much of its power to the executive that it's kind of when it shuts down and stops meeting, it's as if it's just kind of acknowledging the actual situation, which is that Congress doesn't really want to do anything and that the executive doesn't really want to give Congress power to do things, regardless of which party. I mean, I would say this is more true of Trump. I mean, just there are plenty of examples of executive overreach we could point to under Biden, but there were significant acts of bipartisan legislation under Biden, and some of them actually related to things that the Trump administration claims to value, such as the CHIPS Act, reindustrialization, reshoring, chip manufacturing. And the Trump administration seems essentially uninterested in legislating at all. And Congress seems uninterested in, trying to counter that or reassert any of its power. So it's as if when this happens, it's just a kind of acknowledgement of the total hollowing out of Congress. As far as the healthcare thing goes, yeah, it does just seem like we've, in some ways, reached this point where the fundamental flaws with the Obama health reform are just so obvious, and yet neither party really has a meaningful response to the to the situation. If you look at what the conflict over these subsidies is, essentially it has to do with the fact that the insurance industry is charging unsustainable amounts to buyers of insurance, and therefore the sort of government has to step in and continue to subsidize the private insurance industry to continue essentially fleecing customers. Although, I don't want to get too sort of, I don't know, I don't want to sound too much like one of these kind of Luigi fanboys or something, because the insurance industry itself is subject to all kinds of constraints. They're not just sort of being evil for the sake of it. They in turn are dealing with the fact that the actual rising costs of healthcare are creating difficulties for their business. So the point is, the whole system is just this conglomeration of perverse incentives. And the real function of Obamacare was, as a reform, was to protect a certain subset of consumers from directly experiencing the sort of pain of a completely broken and messed up industry that simply doesn't make sense and is incentivized in all kinds of ways to make things worse, more costly, for fewer actual benefits as far as overall health outcomes. And so the real function of the Obama health reform was, I would argue, a small c conservative one. It was to kind of prop up this completely broken system and keep it going for a while. And what we're seeing now is that if you don't kind of keep adding more of these subsidies, then its original function, which is to protect consumers, or at least certain subsets of consumers, from bearing the costs of this system, which is kind of eating itself alive, then if you don't keep adding these subsidies, then eventually that's going to stop working. And so that's the real situation. And the problem isn't simply that the Republicans don't have an alternative. It's that they're just fundamentally dishonest, certainly with the public, I think also with themselves, about what the nature of the problem is and what the nature of the system is. From the beginning, they've claimed that it's socialism, and that it's government healthcare and all this kind of stuff. And again, what it really is a kind of government subsidy to the insurance industry to keep it in a place that is at least politically sustainable. And so, if they can't just kind of be honest about what is going on here in the first place, then they're obviously not going to be able to come up with any meaningful reforms. And at the same time, Democrats don't, because they can't really do anything other than acknowledge position themselves as the people defending the public from the rising costs by adding more of these subsidies. And so it's really just it's a really disastrous situation, and it really seems that there's really no meaningful proposal for moving beyond it in any meaningful way. It'll just the can will keep getting kicked down the road, and probably, and I it's hard to say what will ultimately come of this. I sort of suspect that the midterm pressure on the Republicans will ultimately lead them to accede to some version of these subsidies. But I could be wrong about that, just that there will be enough moderates who are afraid of the blowback in the midterms that they will, or I mean, not necessarily moderates, but people in vulnerable seats will be worried enough about the midterms next year that they will, come around to some sort of extension of these subsidies, which again just kind of keeps this sort of ailing, deeply ailing patient alive a little bit longer. And it's all very bleak. And so again, the two sort of takeaways I would have is, one, we have a a sort of dramatic episode of shutdown, which I think ultimately just reveals a Congress that doesn't really want to do anything and wants to continue ceding all its power to the executive, and so is in some ways kind of happy to just be shut down and sort of acknowledge the reality that, or not acknowledge the reality, but de facto accede to the reality that it's essentially useless and serves no meaningful function in the system. And then at the same time, we have a serious, ballooning problem that, there's simply no meaningful path to addressing that I can see from either party. And both parties are, I'd say, particularly the Republican Party, are just caught up in a completely delusional understanding of what is actually going on with this problem.
It seems to me that the entire American political class appears happy to kind of govern from a position of perpetual crisis management. That seems to be the comfort zone, just sort of turn everything into a crisis, and then nothing actually gets done at a bigger, deeper level. And from my perspective, I think what's happening, bubbling below the surface here, that is being expressed in this shutdown and this impasse, is this crisis of social reproduction, this crisis of the ability to maintain just like the basic life of people. And that the state is more and more taking on. It's not just America. It's happening in all sorts of different countries. You can see that the level of expenditure is just going up and up and up. And it's not because people are just getting sloppy or becoming spendthrift. It's that they're stepping in, they're subsidizing employers not paying enough because their bottom line is squeezed. And just everywhere, like, the human is getting squeezed out. But I would say that that's kind of my typical line on these sorts of things. But that's the thing that I find to be really scary, is that there isn't any good way to deal with any of this. And so what winds up happening is you just have these perpetual emergency situations where you kind of like just slap a big fat plaster on, on a dam that is slowly breaking. And I don't know what that means for the future, because these are quite huge problems. I don't know if they're just kind of hoping to kick the can down the road long enough. I know in other countries, very, very, for instance, you've got high unemployment and you just try to like play with the numbers and hide the unemployment somewhere, out of work, benefits for disability, this sort of thing. You encourage people to go on to disability, this kind of thing. And governments are just doing absolutely everything to play with the numbers, to create emergency situations that put forward just sticking plaster kinds of solutions. And I think what winds up happening is kind of terrifying. I have a sneaking suspicion that in the UK, part of the solution to their healthcare crisis and their crisis of reproduction, and ultimately sort of playing with the stats to get people off of unemployment and onto a disability benefit, is euthanasia. Like, what are you going to do with all these people? Well, in Canada, they're playing around with it long enough that it's like, you're depressed, you're not useful, off you go. That's my kind of extreme outcome. But the point is that we are actually in a really serious crisis situation. We are. That when they sort of govern from a position of crisis, is because there is an impasse. There is a problem with just the very basic rolling forward of everyday life, and the state is having to take up more and more of that, and it's not able to do it. At a certain point, you will not be able to support the reproduction of people in the United States, like the ongoing sort of consumption of people in the United States, from the perspective of the state, when wages aren't covering it, when industry isn't covering it, when the infrastructure is crumbling and isn't covering it, where the shift to the service industry from manufacturing demonstrably failed.
Trump is suing the British Broadcasting Corporation for $1 billion unless it retracts a documentary, apologizes, and offers him financial compensation. This lawsuit is a response to a leaked memo written by an external advisor to the BBC's board. And this advisor pointed out that this documentary, which aired just before the last presidential election, misleadingly edited Trump's speech on January 6th, making it seem as though he was calling for violence. Their have been other problems at the BBC, issues raised in the report related to its coverage of transgender issues, similar things. Ashley, you're a frequent presence on British television, so I want to hear what you think about all this.
Yeah, it's so odd that this is the straw that's breaking the camel's back, because the memo that was leaked that included the note about the fact that the speech had been edited. And I don't know if you've seen the clip, but it is quite striking, the edit. I mean, it spliced together two separate parts of a speech that were an hour apart, and had like a little clip in between, a little, rolling, stock footage or whatever to make it appear like they really
It's
did
pretty.
make it
It's
appear
pretty
as though-
bad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's blatant. But that is pretty well par for the course with the BBC. Like, I'm not at all surprised that they did that, particularly that it was a panorama documentary. Much bigger controversies and scandals, in my opinion, ought to have brought down the BBC, but I suppose nobody's going to sue for these things. But it was revealed some months back that a child that appeared in a major way in one of these documentaries was the child of a Hamas leader, that the producers were Hamas sympathizers, and in response to alleged bias on the part of the Israel-Palestine conflict, and in general in their BBC Arabic reporting, they've now sort of restructured apparently their reporters, the people who are doing that. But it's the bias was so blatant for so long, and then of course on trans issues, like it's absolutely nuts. One of the presenters was disciplined for reading the teleprompter where she was supposed to talk about the risks to pregnant people, and she said pregnant people, and she rolled her eyes a little bit and said women, and carried on speaking. She was disciplined for that. But if you have like a coverage which talks about transgender women as women and attributes their crimes to women, that is not seen as biased. That is not seen as a problem. And so the bias, I mean, there's every time that you sort of allege bias on the part of the BBC, there's 100 people who will say, no, it's biased toward right wing. It's biased toward neoliberalism, whatever. So, people see bias where they want to see it. I grant them that. It's true. But I think, it's quite obvious in some of the coverage of like trans issues and so on, that there was a very powerful left-wing tilt that didn't used to be there. 20, 25 years ago, there used to be. Although obviously the ideal has always been the not just the ideal, but the imperative has always been balanced coverage, and that you're not supposed to give a point of view. There had been conservatives, at least some conservatives were employed by the BBC, and that seems to have completely disappeared. And you can see that, especially as a sociologist, I can see some of the things that sociologists have taught coming through in some of the coverage that the BBC has been putting out. So it's just really shocking that it's just this one thing that didn't attract any attention back when it initially aired, which was before the election, and only caught anyone's attention now because of this leaked memo. I'm shocked that that's the thing that appears to be bringing down the BBC at the moment. I don't think it will, because it's a enormous institution. Where is Trump exactly going to sue? Doesn't look like he could in the UK. Probably wouldn't have a chance in the United States. It'd be difficult to prove that something that he didn't even know about when it first aired caused him $1 billion in damage. And it might be the case that the BBC simply settles, and that would be a win, I think, for Trump, and a major blow against the BBC. So that's most likely how it's going to shake out. But people have been unhappy with the coverage of the BBC for quite some time. It's very, very clearly biased in favor of like Labour. I go on BBC frequently, particular issues that I know liberal lefties don't like, and that it's just brutal. Like, the people who come on with me, they're like, oh, this policy really isn't going to change anything. And they're like, Ashley, why do you want to hurt children? Like, they just nod their head to the other person and go straight at me. So there's like, it's anybody who doesn't go with the flow of leftish pieties notices there's something up at the BBC and doesn't want to pay for it with their license fee. But that they misleadingly edited a clip is the least of the problems at the BBC.
Reform UK needs to campaign hard against the BBC. If a populist movement is going to take power in Britain and try to rule it, it has to destroy the BBC as it currently exists. The licensing fee has to go. This effective kind of media establishment, kind of the current established Church of Britain, just has to be disestablished and allowed to compete on equal terms with whatever GB News, other media alternatives, and things like this. I think indicate that that's probably really on the table. So the BBC probably should be very afraid. But I don't think there's really any possibility at this point of turning the BBC into a kind of broadcaster that's able to fairly cover a phenomenon like Donald Trump or issues like transgenderism or Israel-Palestine. There's just too much internal agreement on these issues where everyone is on a single side. And unless you were to have some kind of huge change in the staffing, it would be really impossible to introduce, actual kind of balance and avoid more, scandals like this. So I think not a lot is going to change at the BBC. It'll no doubt find a way to settle with Trump, but not much will change. Eventually, you're going to get a British government that just with a single parliamentary act ends the BBC as we know it. And that's going to be really, the cost of this. And in terms of, trying to hire people to balance out the coverage, I mean, I don't think there are enough kind of right-leaning journalists in the UK to remotely staff up such an effort. So the only thing that's really going to resolve this is an eventual stunning blow against the BBC with much more kind of seismic consequences than Trump's move against PBS and NPR.
I feel like if you look at comments sections in UK newspapers and magazines, you could just hire a lot of those people to work there to provide some balance, because they seem to have no shortage of sort of, I don't know. It's funny. Like I feel like there was this stereotype decades ago of like, you'd look at the letters section of a British newspaper and it would always be like some retired colonel, who's sort of voicing some sort of reactionary views. But now those guys are all in the comments section. So why couldn't they just do a massive recruitment of those people, give them, bring them into the BBC, bring them in-house. And that solves your balance problem.
Puts them right on the panel. Which, with the best results. I say this as someone who's on GB News all the time. But I will say the sad thing about the BBC is that maybe this is me looking at the past, in an all too rosy way, but I used to love the BBC. Like when I first started to become self-aware, that was through watching BBC World Service. This is how I learned about the world when I was like a teenager. And it's hard to privately fund what the BBC ideally should do and can do and does when it's at its best, which is to have people stationed all over the place. You don't have this anymore, right? Like even CBC in Canada, they closed down my favorite podcast like 15 years ago, my favorite show, which was Dispatches, which was all these journalists that they had all over the world that would give their dispatches in. And they shut it down because they can't afford to have all these journalists all over the place. And they're paying freelancers to do it and that sort of thing by then. But the BBC's got people all over. Something happens, they've got somebody on the ground. That's huge. That's really important, and very few services have that. Few services have the ability to kind of have that kind of in-depth coverage. But unfortunately now, embedded means in bed with, and you can see it in the coverage.
So I was just going to say, the thing that and it's Angela Nagel, sometime Compact contributor, has I think talked about this on her Rocinante podcast recently and has written about it a few times. But I mean, she's quite, pro old BBC, as am I. And I think there is some value in this kind of notion of a common civic culture. The problem is, of course, that just seems to not work anymore. So as Matthew said, it seems like some sort of disestablishment is necessary. But one example that I think of that I used to use teaching classes all the time, which I mean comes from this, I think, really the high point of the BBC as a sort of focal point of a common civic culture, just put out absolutely incredible cultural products and content. And one that strikes me and that I often return to is John Berger's Ways of Seeing, which, I mean, Berger was a radical lefty. I mean, he was a sort of, I'm pretty sure he was like, very whatever, sort of radically pro-Palestine and all these kinds of things. But so it's not that kind of thing wasn't given a place in the BBC of yore, but just the sheer the intellectual and sort of cultural caliber of something like Ways of Seeing, or more recently of Adam Curtis's best work is just it's really extraordinary as a part, again, of a kind of common public civic culture. And I mean, Ashley, you mentioned the CBC. The other, are you familiar with David Cayley?
Yes.
He's the CBC broadcaster. I mean, this is another example of this. His, these programs on the CBC show Ideas are just, really extraordinary stuff. And it's, again,
to them,
it's
some of
public,
them 30 times. They're great. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, it's public intellectual culture. And I don't I think I don't know what the future of anything like that is. Obviously there's ways that it kind of belongs to this broadcast era, which just in purely kind of media technological terms we've moved beyond. But I will just voice a kind of melancholy wistfulness about the passing of, which obviously like it ended a while ago, but the passing of the great age of common civic broadcasting culture. And these, at least it left us these great monuments like Ways of Seeing, which you can watch on YouTube now whenever you like.
I think part of what made people so upset with the BBC is not necessarily that people had a point of view. I mean, as you said, this was always there. This was, this powerfully drove excellent pieces of work. It's the laundering of a point of view as objectivity that annoyed people. So BBC setting up BBC Verify, which everybody knew was somebody's point of view, but they had used that mantle, they had abused it, the mantle of objectivity and authority, to launder activist opinions. And that was it. That was the end of it. People had enough.
Stephen, we published on the Compact site this week your article, How Gay Identity Trumped Gay Sex. It's a really fascinating essay, and it draws from a new book to which you contributed. Can you tell us a bit about your argument and the larger project of which it's a part?
Sure. So the essay is kind of the product of, kind of following the mainstream LGBT gay movement over the last, several decades, and watching how much the category of gayness is increasingly removed from the actual nature of homosexuality, in particular, the sexual aspect of it. So much so that, I mentioned how in Foucault's History of Sexuality, he says that, back in the medieval times, you are defined by your actions more so than by your desire or your particular proclivities, that you are a sodomite if you actually engage in sodomy. If you experience some kind of erotic attraction to people of the same sex, that didn't necessarily designate you a certain category of human being or whatever. But then we see in the 19th century, this kind of medicalized narrative of homosexuality starts to invent the category of the homosexual, eventually leading up until today, where it's, you're gay if you have any kind of homoerotic inclinations. And I kind of make this point that it was expedient for the gay rights movement to invent this kind of category and to kind of completely erase the sexual dimension of homosexuality, because it is inherently different from heterosexuality, which doesn't help the cause of, love is love, equal rights.
This book, Inversion, has contributions from quite a few compact contributors, including your essay. What unites these authors? What kind of is this noting a certain moment in kind of gay reactions to the LGBT movement? What's kind of behind the book, and what do you see as its significance?
I mean, I think what inspired the editors Pierre and Amir to put this anthology together is that they were noticing that there's definitely a vibe shift within all kinds of queer, gay-related discourse. Because, I mean, again, like, there's always been this sense that homosexuality presented this countercultural, transgressive charge, and now that, it's been deemed something completely normal on par with heterosexuality, it's lost what makes it interesting. And a lot of people find that disappointing. They find that frustrating. So, they gathered together a bunch of people who have been writing on this topic, writing about their frustration with the mainstream LGBT movement. And, all the authors have very different points of view, very different attitudes towards morality, towards homosexuality in particular. But I think what unites everybody is that they're kind of tired of how flat the mainstream discourse has become.
Could you kind of say a little bit more about what it means that sex gets evacuated from when it becomes more about feeling? Is that annoying because then it sort of opens up these categories for people who are like, hey, I'm here, I'm holding my rainbow flag because I looked at a magazine funny once and I'm having a questioning thought now. Is that what it is, or is it something kind of deeper?
I mean, to me, what's frustrating is that, like, first of all, you're designated a category just because, again, of desire. It has nothing to do with your actual agency or, how you choose to live, which is, I mean, I don't know. I always thought that was something very confining. And, like, again, it compromises your agency, your freedom as a person. But also, again, like, the idea that, okay, everything is the same, gay and straight, bi, it's all equal. It's a very misleading kind of narrative because, again, sodomy is very different from heterosexual coitus. I mean, it's, needless to say, there are plenty of health risks implicated in it, but also the experience of it is, I mean, you can't pick a child out of it, So this evasion of reality to me has always been very sinister. But as you said, Ashley, like, yeah, you have these people who are like, oh, now because I saw a lot of girls in college who are like, oh, I mean, I think girls are kind of attractive, so now I am bi or I'm queer coded. And it's like, okay, I mean, just because you find a woman attractive doesn't mean you're a lesbian now. So it's, I think we saw that especially when there's a certain social capital associated with claiming a queer identity label, but a study just came out a couple weeks ago showing that Gen Z is, like, decreasingly identifying as any of the LGBT umbrella categories because the social capital is, I mean, like, now that it's kind of cringe to be woke and that all that is passing away, I think we're going to see less and less of that. So
I wonder if this sort of evacuation of sex from LGB, at least, is if you would see it as a similar kind of retreat, a rhetorical trait that kind of won an argument at greater cost. So, for instance, you got the born this way argument, right? Which was like, I saw somebody make an analogy like, oh, it's a bit like being black. They can't help it. And I was like, what? No, that's a horrible thing to say. Because what you're saying is, it would be bad. It is bad, but you can't help it, right? And just by making that horrible analogy, it revealed the fact that actually, you know, you were saying it's bad, but they can't help it, as opposed to sort of saying, so what? What happens if I do choose to live this way? You know, is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, I mean, you see that after the Black Civil Rights movement kind of, reached, like in the 60s when the Civil Rights Act was passed, you see a lot of gay activists intentionally trying to appropriate language from the civil rights movement, saying, oh, like if people were able to accept blacks as equal because like, oh, well, they can't help being black. They're just like you and me. Like, let's use this narrative because it was so effective. And you had civil rights leaders. I mean, I think it was Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson probably, who are like, hold on, you can't use that argument because you're choosing to have sex with people of the same sex. You can't choose to not be black. You can't hide it just like that. So like you had some backlash, but again, that kind of approach, they knew it was effective. So that's why, they kind of adopted that kind of narrative.
But then you never had to defend the acts themselves or be an agentic subject. Sorry, go ahead now. My bad. Go ahead.
Just one last point though, is something that comes up in this book a lot is what does it stand for? Prophylaxis, whatever the thing that you're supposed to take before you have sex. So, I mean, a lot of the writers are saying, like, okay, now that you have this kind of technology, this medical innovation that erases the dangers that come along with gay sex, like, it's much easier to pass off this narrative because, again, you're not going to get AIDS now, so it's all the same.
It's a very Zizek'ian innovation, right? It's the sort of decaf sex or whatever. I was going to bring up, so I wrote this piece about asexuality, which a couple years ago, which touched on some of the same developments, but from a slightly different, I mean, from the angle of these more arcane, I'd say mostly kind of internet generated, the sort of internet generated matrix of sexuality that comes out of places like Tumblr in the early 2010s in particular. And but the thing I was also interested in there was how this relates to, the rise of asexuality as a kind of affirmative identity relates to the so-called sex recession and the idea that, younger people are just having less sex overall and, of whatever kind, and that, people are sort of opting into these identity, or were, maybe this is on the decline, as you pointed out, but, we're sort of opting into these identity categories, but then this seemed to go along with this kind of overall decline in actual sexual activity. And so I was curious how that maybe fits into the story that there are various different ways of interpreting why this sort of sex recession happens. But it's weird how there's a kind of displacement of erotic. It's almost as if there's I think here also of your recent piece about porn and the sort of de-eroticizing effects of porn that you wrote in Compact a few weeks ago. I think that you called like to revive sex, ban porn. So I'm just sort of curious, like, how this question of like the sort of virtualization of sexuality and this kind of fetishization of categories relates to the overall kind of evacuation of sex in general. You talk about the evacuation of sex in favor of identity, and then it seems like there's also just a real documented evacuation of sex from people's lives, that there's like just declining sexual activity.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I think we see this, especially with Gen Z, with the Zoomers, because all these statistics are showing that they're not having sex anymore, which is due to the social lack of socialization, better put. So yeah, I mean, now this category of asexuality, it kind of ties in again with this fact that identity is determined by desire. The fact that I have no desire constitutes a new sexual identity, as opposed to like the actual behaviors I choose to engage in defining who I am. So yeah, like we see this overall emptying of the sexual.
Stephen, where can people buy the book?
You can buy it on Amazon, on Verdurin's website, and all other major booksellers.
Well, let's all go do that. Thank you, Stephen. Thanks to Geoff and Ashley as well. For more, go to compactmag.com/subscribe.